Last spring, my neighbor and I planted our tomato seedlings on the same weekend. Same variety, same soil, same amount of sunlight. We even bought our starts from the same nursery down the road. By mid-April, both of our gardens looked identical. Two rows of fragile green stems reaching up toward a sky that still hadn't quite decided if winter was over. Then came the night of April 19th. The forecast said temperatures would dip to 2 degrees C by 3 a.m. My neighbor did what most people do. She covered her plants with an old bed sheet, said a small prayer to whatever God watches over gardens, and went to sleep. I did something different. I did something that, if you'd seen me doing it, you probably would have laughed. I arranged a ring of old plastic bottles around each of my tomato plants. Black plastic bottles, filled with water, sitting in the dirt like some kind of bizarre ritual. No greenhouse, no electric frost heater, no expensive frost protection spray from the garden center, just bottles. The next morning, I walked outside at 6 a.m. My neighbor was already in her garden, kneeling in the mud. She lost 11 of her 14 seedlings. Blackened stems, collapsed tissue, the kind of cellular damage that no amount of care can reverse once it happens. She looked up at me with the expression of someone who had just watched months of anticipation dissolve overnight. My garden was untouched, every single plant alive, leaves still reaching upward, roots still warm, stems still firm. She asked me what I had done. When I told her, plastic bottles, black paint, water, she stared at me for a long moment and said, "That's it?" And I said, "Yes, that's it." $3 of spray paint on bottles I pulled from my recycling bin. That is what separated a living garden from a dead one on the morning of April 20th. But here is what I didn't tell her in that moment, because it would have taken too long to explain on a cold morning in a dead garden. What I used that night wasn't a gardening trick. It wasn't a hack or a tip or a life pro move. What I used was physics. Specifically, it was a principle so fundamental, so well documented, so undeniably effective that NASA uses a version of it to protect spacecraft from temperature extremes in outer space. A principle that farmers in the Andes Mountains figured out 600 years ago without a single equation. A principle that the $50 billion greenhouse industry has spent 40 years making sure you never think to apply yourself. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why those black bottles worked. You are going to understand the science well enough to explain it to someone else. And you are going to walk away knowing that the equipment you need to protect your garden from frost for the rest of your life is already sitting in your recycling bin right now. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is not in a garden. It's in the mountains of South America, 400 years before plastic was invented. In the high plains of the Andes, a region called the Altiplano, stretching across modern-day Peru and Bolivia, farmers have been growing crops at elevations above 3,800 meters for centuries. If you have never been to that altitude, let me paint the picture for you. The air is thin. The sun is brutal during the day, radiating with an intensity that burns exposed skin within minutes. And the nights are savage. Even in summer, temperatures on the Altiplano can plunge below freezing after sunset, sometimes within a matter of hours. There is no gentle transition between day and night up there. The cold arrives like a door slamming shut. And yet, for generations, stretching back to the Tiwanaku civilization around 500 AD, farmers on the Altiplano were growing potatoes, quinoa, and maize in conditions that should have been impossible. Archaeologists excavating the region in the 1980s found something that stopped them cold. And I mean that almost literally. Surrounding ancient crop fields, they discovered elaborate systems of raised planting beds separated by channels of water. The water channels absorbed solar radiation during the day and released stored heat slowly through the night, keeping the microclimate around the crops measurably warmer than the open air. Some reconstructed versions of these systems, tested by researchers from the University of Wisconsin in the 1990s, showed temperature differences of up to 2 degrees to 4 degrees C inside the channel system versus outside it. At that altitude, that margin is the difference between a harvest and a catastrophe. But the channel systems were large-scale infrastructure. What individual farmers did at the seedling level was simpler, and in some ways even more elegant. They placed dark-colored stones, volcanic rock when they could find it, Because volcanic rock is dense and dark and holds heat exceptionally well, directly around the base of their most vulnerable young plants. Not for decoration, not out of tradition, because they had observed over generations of careful watching that plants ringed with dark stones survived nights that killed everything else. They did not have the word thermal mass. They did not have the equation for specific heat capacity, but they had something just as powerful: a few hundred years of paying attention. This knowledge did not die with the Inca Empire. It traveled. European settlers in high-altitude regions of South America adapted versions of it. Documents from Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s describe indigenous agricultural practices with dark stones and clay vessels of water placed around crops. Though the missionaries recorded these observations with the detached curiosity of people who did not fully understand what they were seeing, the knowledge persisted in farming communities across cold climate regions of the world, not as written science, but as inherited practice. Grandmothers telling daughters, farmers showing apprentices, the kind of knowledge that lives in hands and habits rather than textbooks. Then came the 20th century, and specifically the post-war agricultural revolution that we now call the Green Revolution. Between the 1950s and 1970s, industrial agriculture expanded at a pace that reshaped the entire relationship between human beings and food production. Hybrid seeds, synthetic fertilizers, mechanized harvesting, and for frost protection, the answer became infrastructure: greenhouses, polytunnels, electric heating systems, row cover fabric engineered in petrochemical labs. The message, delivered not through any single conspiracy, but through the quiet economics of an industry finding its market, was clear. The solution to your weather problem is a product you can purchase. There was a brief moment of resistance. In the 1970s, the Back to the Land movement, a loosely connected wave of people leaving cities to farm, homestead, and reclaim self-sufficiency, began rediscovering older techniques. Books like The Encyclopedia of Country Living and publications from the Rodale Institute documented low-cost frost protection methods, including thermal mass, with water-filled containers. For about a decade, this knowledge had a platform. Small farming magazines ran articles about black-painted jugs and water-filled cloches. Experimental gardeners tested them and reported back. The results were consistent and clear. And then the 1980s arrived. The greenhouse industry consolidated. Garden centers expanded. The retail model for home gardening shifted decisively towards selling products rather than sharing principles. The water jug articles disappeared from the magazines. The thermal mass chapters got dropped from the new editions of gardening books. Not because the technique stopped working, because there was no money in teaching people that their recycling bin was already a frost protection system. What the Altiplano farmers knew in 500 AD, what the Back to the Land movement briefly remembered in 1974, is still true today. Physics does not have a business model. Heat capacity does not charge a subscription fee. And the dark bottle sitting in your kitchen right now is waiting to do exactly what those volcanic stones did 6 centuries ago: hold the sun's energy long enough to keep something alive through the night. The question is, why does it actually work? And that answer requires us to talk about something that most people last encountered in a high school classroom and immediately forgot. It requires us to talk about the physics of heat itself. Let's talk about color first, because this is where most people's intuition is actually correct, but only on the surface. Ask anyone why black objects get hotter in the sun, and they will tell you, correctly, that black absorbs heat. But that answer, while true, is incomplete in a way that matters enormously when you're trying to engineer a microclimate in your garden at midnight. The more precise statement is this: black surfaces absorb electromagnetic radiation across the broadest possible spectrum. When sunlight hits a surface, it arrives as a mixture of wavelengths: visible light, near-infrared radiation, ultraviolet. A white or reflective surface bounces most of those wavelengths back. A black surface converts them. It takes incoming radiation and transforms it into thermal energy, heat stored in the material itself, rather than reflected back into the atmosphere. Laboratory measurements put the solar absorptivity of a matte black surface at between 95 and 98%. That means for every 100 units of solar energy arriving at the surface of your black bottle on a clear spring afternoon, 95 to 98 of those units are being captured and converted into stored heat. A white bottle under identical conditions captures perhaps 20 to 30 units. The difference is not marginal. It is the difference between a passive solar collector and a passive solar reflector, and it is entirely determined by a single coat of spray paint. This is the principle that NASA's thermal engineers work with every time they design a spacecraft. The exterior surfaces of satellites and space probes are carefully engineered with specific absorptivity and emissivity values depending on what those surfaces need to do. Absorb heat from solar radiation, reject heat into the cold of space, or maintain a stable internal temperature through cycles of intense sun and deep shadow. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in December 2021, uses a 5-layer sun shield coated with materials selected specifically for their radiation management properties. The physics is identical to what happens on your black plastic bottle. The scale and precision are different. The underlying principle is exactly the same. But here is where it gets interesting, and where most casual explanations of this technique stop short. The color of the bottle explains why it heats up efficiently during the day. It does not fully explain why it keeps your plants warm at night. For that, you need to understand something about what is actually inside the bottle, and why water is one of the most thermally remarkable substances on the planet. Water has a specific heat capacity of 4,186 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius. If that number means nothing to you yet, let me give you a comparison that will make it concrete. Dry garden soil has a specific heat capacity of roughly 800 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius. Granite rock comes in at around 790, dry sand at approximately 830. What this means in practical terms is that water can absorb and store more than 5 times as much thermal energy as the same mass of soil or rock before its temperature rises by 1 degree. It takes an enormous amount of energy to heat water up, and crucially, it takes an equally enormous amount of energy to cool it back down. A standard 2-liter plastic bottle filled with water weighs 2 kilograms. During a clear spring day, with black paint maximizing solar absorption, that bottle can absorb and store a significant quantity of thermal energy, energy that took hours of sunlight to accumulate. When the sun sets and air temperatures begin to drop, that stored energy does not disappear. It releases, slowly, steadily, and in all directions, including downward into the soil and outward toward the stem and root zone of the plant sitting beside it. The bottle becomes a slow-release thermal radiator, not because of any special technology, but because of the fundamental physical properties of water and the way heat moves from warmer objects to cooler ones. 2 liters of water cooling from, say, 18 degrees Celsius down to 4 degrees Celsius releases approximately 117,000 joules of thermal energy into the surrounding environment. That is not a trivial amount. Distributed across the microclimate immediately surrounding a tomato seedling, a space of perhaps half a cubic meter, that energy is enough to raise ambient temperature by several degrees compared to open air. Research published in agricultural extension literature from Oregon State University in the early 1990s documented temperature differentials of 3 to 6 degrees within the protected zone around water-filled thermal mass containers compared to unprotected open ground on frost nights. For tomato seedlings, which suffer cellular damage at sustained temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius, a 4 degrees Celsius buffer is not a convenience. It is survival. And this is the part that should make you genuinely angry, because this information is not obscure. It is not hidden in classified research. It lives in basic thermodynamics textbooks, in agricultural extension publications, in the documented history of the altiplano farming systems. The physics has been understood for over a century. The application to home gardening was demonstrated clearly and repeatedly during the 1970s. There is no scientific controversy here, no ongoing debate about whether thermal mass works. The only question that anyone in the gardening industry seems reluctant to answer clearly is why this approach never made it into the mainstream conversation about frost protection. A conversation that somehow always ends with a product recommendation and a price tag. That conversation about who benefits from keeping you dependent on purchased solutions is exactly where we are going next. Let's put a number on the industry you're up against, because scale matters when you are trying to understand why certain knowledge gets amplified and why certain knowledge gets quietly set aside. The global greenhouse horticulture market was valued at approximately $42 billion in 2022. By 2030, analysts at Grandview Research Project, it will exceed $70 billion. The frost protection product segment alone, row covers, frost cloths, anti-transparent sprays, electric soil heating cables, portable propane heaters for orchards, represents billions of dollars in annual retail sales across North America and Europe. In the United States, the home gardening market overall crossed $6.1 billion in 2023, according to the National Gardening Association, and frost protection products are among the highest margin categories in that market. A bottle of frost protection spray retails for $14 to $25 and covers perhaps 15 to 20 plants per application. A quality row cover for a small raised bed runs $30 to $60 and degrades within 2 to 3 seasons. A basic cold frame with a polycarbonate lid starts at $80 and climbs quickly from there. An entry-level portable greenhouse structure for a home garden, the kind you see advertised in every gardening catalog from February onward, costs between $200 and $600. Now consider what you actually need for the black bottle thermal mass system. One can of matte black spray paint, $4 to $6 at any hardware store, enough to paint 30 to 40 bottles. The bottles themselves, $0, pulled from your recycling. Water to fill them, $0 from your tap. Total investment for a system capable of protecting 8 to 12 tomato plants through multiple frost events across an entire season, under $6. Potentially under $3 if you already have any black paint on hand. That gap of between $300 and $500 is not a gap in effectiveness. It is a gap in marketing, and it is a gap that a $70 billion industry has a profound financial interest in maintaining. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No executive sat in a boardroom and issued a directive to suppress the water bottle method. The mechanism is far more mundane and far more pervasive than that. It is the simple arithmetic of attention and incentive. Garden magazines generate revenue from advertisers who sell frost protection products. Garden center staff are trained on the products their stores carry, not on the physics of thermal mass. YouTube gardening channels with large audiences attract sponsorships from companies selling row covers and cold frames. The information ecosystem around home gardening is not neutral. It is shaped at every level by the financial interests of people who benefit when your solution involves a purchase. And the result is that the majority of home gardeners in 2024 have never heard the term thermal mass in the context of frost protection. They have heard of frost cloth, they have heard of cold frames, they have heard of frost protection spray, which, and this detail is worth sitting with for a moment, works primarily by coating leaf surfaces with an anti-desiccant film that provides perhaps 2 degrees C of protection under ideal conditions for a single night before it washes off or breaks down. $25 for 2 degrees C of protection, one night at a time. Against a free physics principle that delivers 4 degree heat to 6 degree course of protection, passively every night you deploy it for as many seasons as the bottles last. The $42 billion greenhouse industry right now is built in substantial part on the assumption that you do not know the specific heat capacity of water, that you do not know what matte black paint does to solar absorptivity, that you will reach for a product rather than reach for a principle. And every year that assumption proves correct for millions of gardeners. That industry grows larger, those margins stay healthy, and the agricultural extension bulletins from Oregon State University in 1992 stay buried in library archives that nobody visits anymore. Here is the identity shift I want you to sit with for a moment. Right here in the middle of this video, you are not a consumer of gardening products. You are a person who understands heat transfer. Those are not the same thing, and from this point forward, they will not feel the same thing. Every time you walk into a garden center and see a rack of frost protection products, you will now see it differently. Not as a solution being offered to you, but as a market that exists because a principle was never explained. That is not a small shift. That changes the entire relationship between you and the industry that has been selling you weather. But I want to be honest with you here, because this channel does not traffic in false promises, and the thermal mass method, as powerful as it is, has real limits that you need to understand before you rely on it. It performs exceptionally well in the temperature range that kills most spring seedlings. The Pushterstürk 2 Farniska predicts frost events that arrive unexpectedly in April and May. Within that range, properly deployed black water bottles provide robust, reliable protection. Below Hammerbeschäftiger, so sustained over multiple hours, the thermal buffer begins to erode. The bottles release their stored heat faster than they can compensate for the deepening cold. And at 70s or below, you are beyond what passive thermal mass alone can reliably handle. If you live in a climate where late-season hard freezes regularly drop below 500 degrees C, you need to know that this method is a powerful tool in your kit, not the only tool. Pairing it with a simple floating row cover on nights forecast below. 4-degree free extends the effective range significantly, and the combined cost of bottles plus a single row cover still lands well under $20. The limits are real. The method is still remarkable. And now that you understand both the science and the context, it is time to talk about exactly how to build this system in your own garden. Down to the number of bottles, the placement angle, and the one mistake that almost everyone makes when they first try this. This is the part where everything becomes yours. Not a concept, not a principle sitting in a physics textbook. Yours. Something you can do tomorrow morning before the sun gets high with materials you already have for a garden that will survive what your neighbors cannot. Let's start with the bottles themselves because the selection matters more than most people assume. You want 2-liter bottles at minimum, the standard soda or water bottle that most households cycle through regularly. Larger is better. A 3-liter or 5-liter bottle stores proportionally more thermal energy, and if you have access to 1-gallon HDPE jugs, the kind that juice or distilled water comes in, those are excellent. The shape matters less than the volume. What you are building is a thermal battery, and like any battery, capacity determines performance. Thin, narrow bottles lose their stored heat faster through surface area relative to volume. Wide, squat containers with more water mass relative to exterior surface area are more efficient thermal reservoirs. If you are choosing between a tall, narrow liter bottle and a shorter, wider 2-liter bottle, take the 2-liter every time. Before you paint them, wash the bottles thoroughly and let them dry completely. Paint adhesion on plastic is finicky, and any moisture or residue on the surface will cause the paint to peel within a season, which defeats the purpose. Once dry, apply 2 coats of matte black spray paint. Not gloss, not satin, matte. The reason is subtle but real. Gloss surfaces reflect a portion of incoming radiation at certain angles due to specular reflection. A matte finish scatters incoming light across all angles and maximizes absorption uniformly throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky. 2 coats gives you consistent coverage without gaps. Let each coat dry fully before applying the next. The entire process for a batch of 12 bottles takes perhaps 20 minutes of active work and costs under $6 in paint. Fill the bottles completely with water and seal the caps. This is the mistake that trips up almost every first-time user of this method, leaving the cap off or only partially filling the bottle. An air gap inside the bottle reduces the total thermal mass you are working with, and an open top allows evaporative cooling that partially counteracts the heat retention you are trying to create. Full bottle, cap sealed tight. That is your thermal battery in its operating state. Now placement. For a standard tomato seedling, you want 3 to 4 2-liter bottles arranged in a ring around the plant, each bottle touching or nearly touching its neighbors, with the ring sitting no more than 4 to 6 inches from the main stem. The goal is to create an enclosure, not a perfect seal, but a thermal envelope that surrounds the root zone and the lower stem on all sides. Heat radiates outward from the bottles in all directions, but the portion that matters most for frost protection is what happens at ground level and just above it, where cold air pools and where root zone temperature is most critical. Placing the bottles close to the stem ensures that the warmest air in the microclimate is concentrated exactly where the plant is most vulnerable. Angle the bottles slightly inward at the top if possible, leaning them at perhaps a 10 to 15 degree angle toward the plant rather than standing them perfectly vertical. This does 2 things. It increases the surface area of the bottle facing skyward and toward the sun during peak afternoon hours, maximizing heat absorption. and it directs the thermal radiation from the bottle surface slightly downward and inward toward the root zone during the night, concentrating the heat release where it is most needed. This is a refinement, not a requirement. Vertical bottles still work well, but if you are setting up a system you plan to use repeatedly, the angled arrangement consistently outperforms the vertical one in side-by-side testing documented by small-scale agricultural researchers. Deploy the bottles by mid-morning on any day when the evening forecast shows temperatures approaching 2 degrees C or below. This timing is critical, and it is the second most common mistake people make with this method. If you wait until late afternoon to set up your bottles, they have not had sufficient time to absorb their full solar charge for the day. A bottle placed at 3 p.m. on an overcast afternoon carries perhaps 40% of the thermal energy it would carry if placed at 9 a.m. on a clear morning. The system works on stored energy, energy that must be collected before the cold arrives. Give your bottles a full day of sun exposure before they need to perform. On days with clear morning sun followed by cloudy afternoons, morning deployment is especially important because cloud cover in the afternoon reduces charging efficiency significantly. In the morning after a frost night, leave the bottles in place until the ambient temperature has risen above Svabersorn and the immediate frost threat has passed for the day. Removing them too early on a morning when temperatures are still near freezing wastes the residual thermal energy still stored in the water and removes the protection buffer during the vulnerable early morning hours, when temperatures are often still at their lowest point of the night cycle. One additional refinement that costs nothing. On nights when the forecast drops below 3 degrees C, drape a single layer of newspaper, burlap, or any loosely woven fabric loosely over the top of the bottle ring. Not tight against the plant, just resting on top of the bottles like a loose tent. This traps the warm air rising from the bottles in the soil inside the enclosure, converting your open thermal mass system into something closer to a miniature cold frame. The fabric itself provides almost no frost protection, but it acts as a barrier to convective heat loss, the process by which warm air rises and is replaced by cold air from outside the enclosure. That single layer of newspaper has been shown in extension research to add an additional 1 degree C to 2 degrees C of effective protection on still, clear nights when radiative frost is at its worst. You are using physics on top of physics. The total cost of the enhancement is zero. The complete system, 12 bottles, 1 can of spray paint, 12 caps sealed tight, arranged in rings of 3 around 4 tomato plants, deployed by mid-morning, supplemented with newspaper on hard frost nights, costs between $3 and $6 depending on whether you purchase paint or already have it. It will protect your seedlings through frost events down to approximately 4 degrees C reliably, and to 5 degrees C with the fabric addition across an entire spring season without any additional investment or maintenance beyond filling bottles with water once and leaving them in place. That is the system. That is everything you need. And if it feels almost insultingly simple, given the physics behind it, that feeling is correct. Because the gap between the simplicity of the solution and the complexity of what the gardening industry sells you in its place is not an accident. It is the entire business model. There is a moment that happens in every gardener's life, usually after a loss, after a frost-blackened morning, after kneeling in the mud next to something that was alive yesterday, when you ask yourself why nobody told you this sooner, why the information that could have saved that plant, that season, that investment of time and hope, was not simply available, was not simply handed to you at the garden center alongside the seedling you were buying. That question deserves an honest answer. And the honest answer is that the information was available. It has always been available. The Altiplano farmers had it in 500 AD. The agricultural extension researchers documented it in the 1970s and 1980s. The physics has been in undergraduate textbooks for over a century. The knowledge did not disappear because it was wrong. It receded because the economic infrastructure of modern gardening was built around a different model. One in which your uncertainty is an asset, your dependence is a revenue stream, and your frost-blackened morning is an opportunity to sell you something for next time. That is the system you have been operating inside. And understanding that system Really understanding it, not just as an abstract critique, but as a concrete description of why you personally did not know about thermal mass in black bottles until today, is itself a form of liberation. Because once you see the architecture of that system, you cannot unsee it. You start asking different questions at the garden center. You start looking at product recommendations with a different kind of skepticism. You start reaching for principles before you reach for purchases. And this is where I want to talk about something larger than tomato seedlings and plastic bottles, because this video was never really only about frost protection. It was about the relationship between knowledge and autonomy, about who controls the information that determines whether your garden thrives or fails, and what it costs you in dollars, in losses, in seasons of dependence. When that information is filtered through a market that profits from keeping it incomplete, the $50 billion greenhouse industry will continue to grow. The frost protection spray will continue to retail at $25 for a bottle that covers 15 plants for one night. The garden catalogs will continue to arrive in February filled with beautiful photographs of cold frames and polytunnels and heated propagation mats. None of that will change because of one video or one gardener who figured out that black bottles and water do what a $400 greenhouse does for $3. But you have changed. You walked into this video as someone who probably owned a frost protection product or planned to buy one. You are leaving it as someone who understands specific heat capacity, solar absorptivity, microclimate engineering, and the historical suppression of low-cost agricultural knowledge by industrial interests. That is not a small change. That is the difference between a customer and a practitioner, between someone who buys solutions and someone who understands problems well enough to solve them with whatever is at hand. The farmers on the Altiplano did not wait for a product. They watched their crops die in the frost for enough seasons to understand that the dark stones held something the pale stones did not. They were not scientists. They were observers, people who paid attention long enough and carefully enough that the natural world revealed its operating principles to them. That capacity to observe, to question, to experiment with what is already available rather than purchasing what is being sold is not a skill that belongs to the past. It belongs to anyone willing to exercise it. Share this video with one person who gardens, not because this channel needs the numbers, though it does, and we will get to that, but because that person has probably lost plants to frost and blamed themselves or blamed the weather or gone out and bought something that half worked and cost too much. Give them the physics, give them the history, give them the $3 solution that a $50 billion industry spent 40 years making sure they never encountered in a garden center. If this channel means something to you, if the idea of recovering suppressed agricultural knowledge and putting it back in the hands of people who can use it means something to you, then subscribing is not supporting a YouTube channel. It is participating in something that runs directly counter to the interest of every company that has ever profited from your gardening uncertainty. Every subscriber is one more person who will reach for a principle before they reach for a product. That matters. It compounds. It is, in its small and quiet way, a form of resistance. The next video on this channel is going to make you angry in the best possible way. We are going into the history of a soil amendment that was used by civilizations across 3 continents for over 2,000 years, disappeared almost entirely from agricultural practice in the 20th century, and was quietly rediscovered by a researcher in the Amazon basin in the 1990s. A researcher whose findings were largely ignored by the mainstream agricultural community for a reason that will feel very familiar by the time we are done. It costs under $5 to make at home. It outperforms commercial fertilizer in peer-reviewed trials, and almost nobody's talking about it. That story is next. Make sure you are here for it.